Hello. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you so much to IPCNY for the opportunity. Yeah, so I make a lot of work that sort of explores our nuances, or the nuances of our relationship with everyday, domestic, and especially functional objects. I pay special attention to sort of ordinary, unseen things that we might not recognize or pay attention to, especially because we use them and because, you know, they are so close to our body in certain ways, which is sort of an interesting tension for me. And yeah, my work sort of hopes to highlight the edges of design and construction and kind of these choices that become sort of invisible to us and to me as well, certainly. I'm starting to think a little bit more about that in relation to consumption and garbage and waste. So a lot of the photographs of objects that I collect and the objects that I use for sculptures are from thrift stores and dumps and recycling centers. So these are chairs that were kind of laying around that I thought were particularly ordinary. And I wanted to kind of spend some time highlighting them. Yeah, the work, these pieces developed initially. I had an exhibition in a really unique space that had a really tall ceiling at the center, and I think a lot about architecture in my work as well, and I wanted to create a piece that kind of highlighted the real beauty of the height of this space, and so I wanted to make pieces that sort of, in order to fall in the center of the room at kind of an ordinary, unrecognizable height, had to sort of make this immense effort to reach all the way to the top, to the ceiling. So these are actually even longer and higher than they are now, but they can be sort of custom rolled to any ceiling space. Yeah. Materially, I think that the silk, aside from having this kind of strange effect where they can sort of blend into the natural background and maybe even for a moment appear natural, I really enjoy the idea that the sort of absurd lightness of them is, you know, kind of juxtaposes these really solid, kind of weighted functional objects that, of course, you know, I'm going through this effort to create them but then making them useless. And so I definitely think a lot about absurdity in my work and wanting to have sort of a touch of humor as well. So the silk for me also definitely references memory and the sort of ephemeral nature of the way that we handle objects and use objects, and the way that we purchase and then discard objects. So that's very interesting to me as well. Process-wise, these, I initially thought that I might try a CMYK silkscreen print for them, but on this particular material, it was very challenging to register them. So I took a note from I teach a lot of silkscreen classes, and some students in my class had been experimenting with sort of pops of color on the screen and then pulling them through with a squeegee. So they're two layers technically, a sort of white layer that gives it hopefully a little bit of solidity, and then a second more translucent brown ink on top, which has some kind of pops of yellow and blue and some other colors that I thought would make them kind of feel a little bit more realistic. Yeah, and I initially was a little frustrated with the fact that it was so difficult to register, but then this sort of imperfect kind of drooping nature of them and the way that they really are kind of, you know, like slumping into the floor was actually very satisfying to me, and I've come to kind of feel satisfied even with the sort of crinkles and ridges that they sort of inherently have. A lot of printmaking for me is sort of accepting the imperfections in the process and sort of going with them, so that felt very, very true to these as well. And yeah, so looking forward, I hope to create work that kind of touches a little bit more on our sort of the consumption that we have of objects in relation to climate change and the way that we kind of can use something and then discard it, and sort of when does that line happen where we decide that something is no longer useful to us, and is it still useful to someone else, and where do those things go? So yeah, also focusing on domestic space is really, I hope to kind of look at artwork and labor and domestic work sort of through a critical feminist lens. So I think that's it. But yeah, thank you.